And welcome back to Sets and Reps. I'm Dr. Michael Landrum here with Travis Erickson.
Hello.
How's it going, Travis?
You know what? I can't complain. We talked a few weeks ago about me trying to get in better shape, and I've been successful so far in dropping a few pounds. Feel pretty good. Hungry, but I feel good overall, so I can't complain.
Yeah, well, it's noticeable. I do think that you are slimming up a little bit, but it's a marathon, not a sprint, and I guess like we kind of talked about before, it's more of a lifestyle change ultimately.
Right.
I know it's always funny when people do a diet or change their diet for a few weeks and then they hit their goal, whatever it is. Maybe a lot of it's due to water loss.
Right.
But then they go back to the way they were doing things before and are like, well, why is my body going back to the way it was before? So
I think, well, as I zero in on my goal, we can revisit this on a future podcast. But today we introduced this topic last week. Maybe you want to kind of espouse upon what we're going to do today.
Yeah, so we were talking about whether or not getting experience is important in career development, or perhaps book learning might be one of the more important things for that. And we talked a little bit about, and I'll let you take this over, how different majors probably put different emphasis on those two aspects. So can you remind us a few of those examples?
Sure. I mean, from our own area of exercise science, you're typically a person that's well-versed and that probably leads a healthy life that includes physical activity, proper nutrition, all those kinds of things hopefully are a part of that person's life because they know about it. And so the things that they've learned in their studies of exercise science have led them to actually change the way they live their life. Whereas a person who may be an astrophysicist, that knowledge may not really change the way in which you live your life. It may change your view of things, but it's not kind of changing your actual day-to-day kinds of things. So I think there's just certain professions have ways of changing the way you approach things. And whereas I've got a friend of mine who is an optometric technician, and so he's always very sensitive about the eye because he knows about it. And so, and we all know somebody like that who is so specialized in one area that they're hypersensitive to any issues in those regards, right?
Yeah, sure.
But there's other professions that perhaps there's not that same kind of bearing on it.
Yeah, more general and things like that.
Right. Like a philosopher, does that change the way you live your life? Maybe a little bit, but
why?
Yeah,
would it do that?
That'd be the existential question we would ask ourselves at this point, right?
Yeah. But like you could see somebody in English, perhaps you can read as many books as you want to, but until you start putting pen to paper, then you can't really be a writer, or I guess type in it on your computer in a coffee shop.
Right.
Maybe that might be for attention more than anything else. So I did a little bit of background research. My brother-in-law and maybe soon-to-be brother-in-law, both named Brian and both accountants. I went and found out a little bit about them, because we might think that somebody in a financial field would have their finances in order. Insofar as I hope, with my sister involved, they do. So we kind of asked them what got them into that, and it turns out it's kind of what we thought when we were talking about this outside the podcast, was that they had a natural inclination towards math and numbers. They were always good with those numbers growing up. It came easy to them. But they didn't necessarily like science or something where you could apply. Statistics seemed awfully dry, but it was also at a time when you were learning calculus as opposed to statistics in high school or whatever. I know that there's kind of a shift towards that in some states where they see that as the more beneficial or subject to learn for their students.
Right. We even speculated that a person that may be good with numbers, a teacher perhaps would say to them, "You should go be an accountant" or whatnot. So they would be informed about what they should do, or if I show a great deal of compassion, someone might say, you should be a psychologist, right? We kind of said that maybe with the genesis of a person's career aspirations is someone that they admire or respect has told them, you're good at this, you should pursue it, right?
Yeah, and that push, whether you want to call it the it moment, like before it happened, your life was going on one path, and then after it happened, it was a different trajectory. But a lot of times it's that push from an authority figure recognizing your talents or your natural proclivities, whatever it is, and trying to encourage you to pursue them.
Right.
And that's pretty much what happened to both of them that I was talking to.
Interesting,
so as they were going through, they had somebody saying, that you're good at math, and here are professions that you can use that sort of thing in. So as they went through, they also started to look at other things like job stability.
Okay.
Pretty much like nursing, for instance.
Right.
You're probably always going to need accountants for better or for worse. And so they're thinking, okay, I can pretty much always have a job somewhere. But it's not related to a certain field, though, like, nursing would be in the medical field. Not like that's going away either. But it's still, you can't have, something go out of business and then, now I can't get a job anywhere else with these numbers. So
my mother's maiden name is Cooper, by the way.
Oh.
And so a Cooper, for those who don't know, is a barrel maker, right? And so that's a profession we typically don't see very much anymore, right? And so
exactly.
certain fields have kind of gone by although there certainly are barrels still being made, but I don't know how many are being made by hand.
Right, exactly. Yeah, or tanners, or your
right.
Making
but accountancy, like you said, or the medical field, those are not going to go away anytime soon.
I wouldn't imagine so.
Right.
Although, as we were talking about before this, the doomsday clock just recently got moved to 3 minutes to midnight. So we'll see.
To which I said, "What is a doomsday clock?" And you almost went through the roof because I didn't know what it was.
I know, right? Well, I guess I'm a little sensitive to those sort of things too. But
I should be, apparently. If that means the end of the world as we know it, I guess I should be sensitive to it.
Maybe it might just be more trying to alert us to things and not answers, because I'm sure that a lot of things could happen before that.
Right.
Getting back to topic.
Yes.
So also you can kind of take it anywhere in the world where its numbers are pretty much a universal language.
Yes.
Wherever you go. So you're going to need to keep track of those books, whether you're here in Singapore, in Abu Dhabi, wherever it might be. You're going to have somebody fulfilling that role. So that was another thing that really appealed to them. So a lot of job security, above average pay, that's of course going to be something that also appeals to many people, a certain lifestyle. I think we see that within our major with people trying to go towards physical therapy.
Right.
Perhaps doesn't have the insurance costs that a medical doctor would, and has maybe better hours in some cases than it would. So but the pay is comparable enough.
Right.
The schooling is comparable enough that they're willing to go through.
Right. We see that with students that want to pursue physician's assistance programs as well. It's the same kind of deal, right?
Although oddly, every so often you hear students say that they think that physician assistant is the easier route. If I don't get into physical therapy, I'll just become a PA. Don't worry about it. No big deal.
Right.
And well, they're in for a rude awakening when they see the number of hours they need to get in those observation hours.
That's right. Well, they're not even observation; they had to be paid hours. You actually need to be in there doing it, right? That's right. Yep.
Yeah, man, that's a whole different conversation. But
well, I would say, in those regards, then if we're taking two sides here on this issue, if I'm kind of more looking at the experiential part of it, I would say that those observational hours that physical therapists wannabes need, or the actual patient care that a physician assistant wannabe needs, I would say those are driven by the idea that we want these students to experience things before we go and teach them the book learning part of it, right? Okay,
I could see that. However, I'll counter with, and go back to my kind of example, that book learning I think would be incredibly important in that, because first you got to figure out where the debits go and where the credits go, how to do that sort of thing. But even having that base knowledge before you can really jump in there, and whether or not you know enough to be dangerous, or not even enough to be a catastrophe waiting to happen. But having that underlying knowledge, I think, is very important, especially in the medical field, because if you don't know, for instance, when I teach anatomy and physiology, we don't really go into pathophysiology when we have disease set in until we understand the underlying physiology, because you don't know how things go wrong until you know how they're supposed to work correctly in homeostasis or whatever.
But I would counter and just say, for example, one of the first things I think a lot of medical students learn, we teach it here in our undergrad, is how to take a proper blood pressure.
Yes.
And if a student understands what blood pressure means, if they understand through reading and maybe watching practical examples how to measure it, that doesn't mean they'll necessarily be able to do it themselves. They actually still have to experience the process and do it, because simply knowing about systolic versus diastolic blood pressure and how they change in response to exercise, or what vasodilation means or constriction, they can know all that stuff they want, but if they sit down with a patient and cannot properly inflate the cuff, or do not know how to use the valve or whatnot, that's going to be a real limiting factor for them.
Yeah, very much so. And I'll even agree with you to the point that once you start getting to exercise blood pressure, then that's all skill over and art over science, I guess you say. But I'll throw this one back at you. We do see that if you go too far on the applied and skill side and not the book learning, that every so often you'll get a student taking blood pressure and then they aren't listening for the sounds, they're looking at the ticks on the sphygmometer, and then they know that the first tick I see, that must be systolic, and when they stop, that must be diastolic. When
it's not accurate.
You're not actually getting it. So if you don't have that underlying understanding of what these things mean and how to properly take these, then you can have all the experience in the world, but if you're getting incorrect experience, then you're not going to be be able to be a good practitioner.
No, you're right about that. I think that there is something to be said for that. Yeah, but I will say this in regards to that, though, is that, for example, in my class I'm teaching right now, we did resting blood pressure measurements last week, and this week we're getting into exercise blood pressure measurements, which is very relevant to our topic right now. And these students, because we talk about it in class, they expect certain things to happen. So, for example, they're expecting heart rate to go up as we begin to exercise. They're expecting systolic blood pressure to also go up when they exercise, and they're expecting diastolic blood pressure to remain relatively constant during exercise. And so in their heads, they have that knowledge of what they think should happen. And what can happen then is that when they take their measurements, they may actually doctor their results a little bit, or think they hear things that are trying to match their expectations as opposed to actually recording what's actually occurring. And so there can be an issue, I think, where I don't think there's a case where too much knowledge is bad, but sometimes our knowledge can cause us to expect things that maybe aren't actually there, right?
Yeah. Oh, I know, and I think that a lot of times as a researcher we have to worry about that too, because you as much as we all try to put our biases aside, leave that at the door, but as doing your literature reviews, there are some expectations. Why are you even doing this study? Because for better or for worse, unfortunately, now you have to have significant differences in order to publish things. You can't really publish non-results. And although maybe that is a result there, and there are journals that do accept those.
And to your point, I mean, to your side, talking about knowledge being perhaps to some degree more important than practical experience. Like a lot of our students that want to do thesis projects or research projects in graduate school, their hypothesis is based upon their own experiences. And as faculty members, we attempt to try to get those students to do that lit review early in that process to hopefully get them to challenge what their own preconceived notions are. Because if they don't do that lit review early, the way they construct the research question and the whole data collection could be biased or geared towards proving what they already believe to be true, right?
Yeah, we've seen that multiple times.
Oh, sure.
Where they go through and the way you set up your testing would get or at least try to get a very specific result. But that's not really the truth. They're setting it up to get a false answer for what they're trying to test. And that's, we also try to teach them about research. That's what we're trying to get. What's the truth of this matter? Because whether or not it's what you think it is or what the science turns out to be, I mean, that's kind of what we end up having to rely on later, is being able to put this quantifiable evidence out there for other people to review and then use in order to develop their own theories as we go forward.
I in some ways, and we can maybe tie this into the field of strength and conditioning in some ways, I think there's some level of insecurity for some of these research students or any kind of researcher where you strongly believe something so fervently that you just want to demonstrate that you're correct, right? And so you construct research questions and the way you collect the data and all that is all designed to just validate your own opinion on things. And I think that coaches can do that at times as well, and as soon as they're challenged by another coach, but even more specifically science that says you shouldn't be doing it that way, there's no real evidence to suggest that this super long static stretching protocol you're doing before this sprint workout is effective at reducing injuries. But that coach who's been doing it for so long says, "Oh, get out of my way! I know what I'm doing." Right? And I think this is getting at that idea that we need to have both, right? We need to have knowledge and experience to go into it.
Yeah, very true. Because I've worked with coaches that do, as soon as I got a PhD in whatever field, and let me tell you how it, what we think it is, and all that, and then they shut off and they won't listen to a thing afterwards. Whether because you might be younger than them or not in that, you aren't a coach yourself in this sport, so what do you know about it?
Right.
I've got all these accolades from past athletes. And
sure.
Whether or not that's just lucky because they're great athletes and you could put them in a ditch somewhere and they'd still be able to give you a top 3 podium placement. Or if it's really your methods. And of course they vary from person to person. So I know I've worked with some wrestling coaches, for instance, that we have changed minds from it's not really always the best idea to have them go out for their aerobic training and do a 10-mile run.
Right.
What they might need to do is something more that simulates the matches a little bit better. So almost circuit training, if you will. That's
intervals of some sort,
intervals.
Right.
And that's what a lot of the research tends to pan out with, too. But being open to that change in idea, having to restructure your practices is a valuable asset. So
we're seeing that, I think, there's starting to be more and more research, certainly here, looking at mechanical efficiency for distance runners. And I think distance runners typically are a group of people that do not normally like resistance training.
Yeah.
That's a pretty fair. It's certainly not true for all distance runners, but I think that's a fair statement to say. But what we're kind of seeing with a lot of the mounting evidence is that a certain degree of strength and ability to create power is really helping these runners be more efficient while they're running. Yeah. But that's going to be a hard thing to convey to some coaches, isn't it?
Yeah, very true. And I think some coaches also need to take into consideration what their athletes know about themselves, because as you become a higher level coach and you work with athletes that have been participating in a sport for decades or more perhaps, your college level, a lot of times they know how their body is going to respond to a certain type of training, whether they've had before or they've dabbled in it themselves or had problems with it. There's, of course, a lot of caveats there with follow-through, but just same as you go higher and higher in those levels, you've got to listen to your athletes. I think last week I said something where, you can teach people or you can read a lot in books about how, okay, well, here's how you bring somebody from a 200 to a 300-pound squat.
Right.
But going from a 900 to 1,000 pounds.
It's a whole different, you can't do it the same way,
there's
right.
not really a lot of literature on that because there's only a handful of people that can even do that sort of thing.
Right,
so,
right.
In that case, we've got to listen to those athletes and figure out how they're able to get there, how they're able to stay healthy throughout the probably decades of training to take them to that place.
Well, it's interesting, because the NCAA just passed a regulation requiring that all collegiate strength coaches at the Division I and I believe the Division II level and not D3 yet, but are required to be certified by a national governing agency as a strength coach, and so. Specifically, they're highlighting the National Strength and Conditioning Association and the the CSCCA, which is Collegiate Strength Coaches Association. So those two groups, the NSCA and the CSCCA, both have certifications. The NSCA has their CSCS, and the CSCCA has. I apologize, I'm not certain what they're. I've never been certified with that group because I'm not an active strength coach, but. They each have a certification that meets the criteria for the NCAA. And so they're kind of gradually phasing this in to try to get at the idea that we want these strength coaches to be knowledgeable, right?
So
and not just be football players that are now strength coaches, right?
The old mentality that the best players make the best coaches, because that's not always the case. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it definitely is, but other times it's not. And I think that's a good example of having an underlying book learning.
Right.
But then oftentimes we see with strength coaches, they have to kind of go out and then do a lot of internships, get that experience.
That's right.
And it's almost, that becomes the more important part, whether it's because of networking or what other aspect, just working with different athletes, because like I said, working with somebody who's trying to move their whatever exercise, whatever the event is to that next level, maybe there isn't a lot of book referential learning you can do.
Well, and there's a lot of bias even within, I was a Division III strength coach and more importantly a Division III track and field coach, and the coach that I worked directly underneath, Mark Guthrie, he's the winningest Division III track and field coach of all time, won 20 national titles, but could not get a Division I track coaching job to save his life because he was viewed as, you're a Division III track coach, and that's different than... And it was always we used to kind of chuckle about it, but it's like a stopwatch. If I coach an athlete to run a 46-second quarter, it's not because the Division III track is smaller or the stopwatch runs differently. It's like they ran a 46-second quarter.
Yeah.
And if I can help a D3 kid do that, I can certainly do the same thing for a D1 kid. But it may be to your point where it's just like, well, if I'm working with elite level athletes on a daily basis, that's different than I'm working with your Division III athlete, which is not going to typically have the same athleticism,
and
right?
I think we could see that where as you choose your career path and get experience in one way, you can kind of almost eliminate these other options for you where you have too much experience in this aspect, but then not enough in these others, and whether it's, I'm sure no one's exhibiting ageism because you can't do that, but it's, we just don't think that you would be a good fit here because it seems like you're set in your ways.
Yeah.
But then again, maybe because you're set in your ways, that's the exact fit we want for our program because that aligns with program outcomes.
Well, you look at too. I mean, we've talked about this before, but the whole field of exercise science was born out of physical education. That's where that came from. And it used to be a time when your college professors were professors. They had a doctorate, right? But they were also coaches. They did two things. They were actively coaching and they were actively doing scholarship of some sort. Now this discipline's changed a lot. Now as exercise science has broken away from physical education, we're starting to see a rise in adjunctification or non-tenure track faculty members like myself that are teaching, and I'm indirectly involved in research, but I'm not engaging in my own independent research. And so I'm relying upon my experiences in a lot of cases. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think that we're in danger in higher education probably of going too far and having too many people like myself that, I try to remain active and knowledgeable about research, but I'm not directly involved in it probably the way that I should be when I work with some of my students.
Yeah, and you see, I guess that is one aspect of academia, but then when you get out into the practitioners in the field, you can sometimes, I suppose, get around that where you don't get people set in their ways because of continuing education.
Yes.
You need to at least be doing something to be learning,
Right.
whether or not you get that much from the conference you go
Right,
to, and
right,
you're actually
right.
engaging people,
Right,
going to these
right.
talks and asking questions,
Right.
trying to learn there, or are you just showing up? Because
Right.
I've seen people do
Oh
both.
yeah, I mean, an effort's made, I think, on the case of hospitals and the case of even personal trainers. They're, if you're going to maintain some licensure or certification, you must
Right.
do a certain amount of continuing education. But
Yeah.
how much actual education goes? Right.
Exactly. I mean, because I've had some, I guess, webinars that I've been a part of that
Right.
weren't the most beneficial. I
Right.
think they could have
Right.
just sent me the materials
Right.
because it's one of the lackluster PowerPoint presentations
Right.
that was made by the company that publishes the book, and it was that was made by somebody who's not even in the field.
Right.
It's just
Right.
let me pull out the bolded or the section headers
Yeah.
for each of these, and
Yep.
I know how to pull out those, but it's not really effective teaching in that case.
Well, and I've gone to national conferences as well, where you look at the agenda ahead of time and you kind of pick out, because with the National Strength and Conditioning Association, they typically at the national meeting have two different tracks going on. So they've got, you can go see this person or you can see this person. They're talking at the same time. And in addition, there's free communications or research presentations going on. So you can always choose what you want to go to, or you can choose to go to nothing.
Yeah.
And if you're in Vegas, you can go gamble or whatever, right? But in a lot of cases, it kind of, that whole, I think, idea of insecurity can rear its ugly head again, where it's like, well, this person's talking about something that I already know about, so I want to go see him or her because they're going to validate what I already believe.
I can sit and agree with myself for an hour.
Right.
Like, these fools, I already knew it all along.
Right. So it takes a special kind of person to kind of be willing to step outside their comfort zone and learn about something that they don't already know about, right?
And it is difficult because as professionals, you're expected to be a knowledgeable in your area and be an authority in that area.
Right.
So
Right.
challenging your authority or your knowledge is kind of anathema to what we are supposed to project.
Yeah.
That we know the answers to
Right.
these questions
Right.
that the lay population would ask us. What do I eat? How do I exercise? Things like that. And you may have an idea in your head, but in 10 years it might be a little bit different.
Sure. Yeah, it's fascinating to kind of. I love the first couple of weeks of the semester because students are curious a lot of times. They want to know certain things, and as they kind of start to learn about the topic that you're addressing, they get invested in it, and they start asking good, pertinent questions. And sometimes I can answer them, sometimes I can't. There's no maybe good answer for them. I had a student just the other day ask me, "How long does it take omega 3s to impact the health of your joints?" And I said, I don't know. I don't know if anyone really knows that answer right now. It probably depends upon how much omega-3s are already in your diet. I mean, maybe you're already getting all you need, and so superfluous amounts are not going to do anything for you, right? So it's neat to have those kinds of questions that these kids want to learn.
Yeah, and that's actually funny. That's probably, I make a joke like the first day. It's not really a joke. It's more a statement of fact in nutrition, where the most common answer that you're probably going to get in this class is, it depends.
Right.
Because we deal with a gamut of sports and athletics and age groups and that sort of thing. And, training a marathon runner versus training an Olympic weightlifter are two totally different scenarios.
Right.
You can't treat them the same, let alone the same point in their periodization cycle, in their training cycle, because if you're in a high volume phase, you're probably going to have a lot more calories being expended than you do during your peaking phase, where you're doing 3 singles, and that's your workout for the day.
Right.
So, it's going to be a lot of, gray area in there about what's the most appropriate. We may have a lot of really good ideas throughout, and we can apply it to certain sports, but maybe we don't have all the answers, and that's where you have to take a little bit of that book learning, mix it with your experience, and give it a shot, see if it works for that person.
Right. And it's hard, in coaching, if you're working with a team in particular, you don't always have the luxury of customizing the training program for each individual member. for better or for worse, everyone's got to kind of do the same sorts of things, and it's going to. And as a coach, hopefully you understand that it's not going to impact everybody the same.
Right.
And so maybe you learn to customize certain things. But the same thing can happen in the medical field where it's like, well, I have to do it this way because that's the way the hospital requires that I do it, or best practices require, or insurance requires I do it this way, even though my experience tells me otherwise. But I still have to do it a way that may not be what I want to do.
Right, yeah, it's a great example there, because there are a lot of governing bodies that do kind of dictate, and for lack of a better term, how you should proceed with your, your professional career and your practice of that.
Right. So how do we resolve this? I mean, what's the wrap up here? I mean, what is the consensus, or what's the take home message that we can impart?
Well, I think that we kind of touched on this as we went through, and then identified the significance of not only book learning but also experiential learning, like having both of those, because the experience may not make the most sense or may not be able to be directed in a very meaningful way without that underlying knowledge, because a lot of that book learning, those books that are written, are based on hundreds of articles of maybe hundreds of years of experience for that matter, where we can look back and see what works and things like periodization, for instance. There's ways to mix it up, between linear and undulating and
whatever else you want to call it, right?
Yeah, there's dozens of ways to do that sort of thing, but it's a pretty common approach because we've known this has been working for a long time.
Right.
So if you want to get, continue to improve, then this is a good way to vary your intensities, your durations, and frequencies, and all that.
And I would say from the experiential level that you never know what experiences you're going to have and how they'll help you in the future. Right. And so, especially the students that we work with, they to some degree have a little bit of tunnel vision. They see themselves going a certain direction, and they see themselves engaging in specific experiences, and they may not realize that an experience that is one that they wouldn't necessarily kind of think of. That may actually be helpful down the road. You may be exposed to something, or learn a special technique or whatnot, or work with a different kind of population that 10 or 20 years from now, that experience will be very valuable for you. And that'd be my suggestion. Like, just go out there and try different things.
Well, that's kind of funny you say that, trying different things, because and I've been met with some resistance here from students and people before, where I always say that to me it's more important to figure out what you don't want to do than what you really want to do.
Yep.
Because you can only find that out by trying a whole bunch of different things. Working in a commercial fitness facility, working in a clinical fitness facility, working for strict clinical rehabilitation in academia. There's a lot of different avenues for exercise science specifically, but many career paths. But you're not going to know which one of those is right for you unless you try out a whole bunch of them.
Right.
Because one, for better or for worse, we make students oftentimes choose their career path before they've even had a chance to really start to reflect on who they are, what's important to them. A lot of times money is what's going to be the driving factor, whether it's because somebody else might be paying for their education, so we want to make sure you're getting something lucrative out of it. That might be beside the point, or might be the entire point there.
Right. I think we can apply the same principle to learning about information too, because if you don't know what you don't know, you're not going to learn about it, right? So sometimes it's reading an article or attending a seminar that maybe you don't think has any pertinence to what you want to learn about. There might be a nugget in there that will click then and there, or a month later, or a year later.
Because for most all of us, we're going to have to, after we make that career choice, we're going to have to stick with that for twice the time we've even been alive at that point in order to see it through. Just because that might get into a later topic of sunk cost versus opportunity cost.
Oh man, you're gonna throw your business knowledge on me now? Is that where this is going to go?
Specifically economics, I suppose? No, I don't think. But that does really tie into it because, as for better or for worse, we see a lot of higher education is starting to be run as a business. So you might have to make those kind of calculations. I think we see a lot of universities making those calculations themselves, as we're lucky that we're in the STEM field, so we are getting accentuated now, but others are. I went to a liberal arts undergrad, so I think a lot of those humanities are very important. It's made me a more three-dimensional person. Sometimes it makes it better because I can take stories from elsewhere. Talk about Milos of Crete as, if we talk about periodization or progressive overload. And, maybe that makes it more enriching. Maybe it doesn't do anything. But I think that it's neat, and it's made my life more three-dimensional because of that.
Well, take us out of here, Michael. End this podcast.
Well, I guess never stop learning. Always try and seek out some new information. Try and do more than yesterday, but always keep that to be less than what you're going to do tomorrow. So, till next time, we'll see you later.
Wise words.